40 years ago to the day I'm posting this video, July 28th, 1982, a Cessna 414 airplane crashed in Garden Valley, Texas, taking the lives of the pilot and all 11 passengers on board. Among them were 28-year-old Keith Green, his 3-year-old son Josiah, and 2-year-old daughter Bethany, leaving behind 1-year-old daughter Rebecca with his wife Melody, who was expecting their 4th child, Rachel. Today, I reflect on the life and music of Keith Green, coming up on Andrew's Journey in Christian Contemporary Music. Welcome to Andrew's Journey in Christian Contemporary Music, where we dive into the classics, discover what's new, and demonstrate the originals. If you're into all things Christian contemporary music, I would encourage you to hit that red subscribe button. And don't forget, if you're liking this video, to please give it a thumbs up. It's really important. Climb aboard. Let's do the CCM journey together. Keith Green. What more can one say about his contribution and impact on CCM that hasn't already been said? I suppose if there was a Mount Rushmore of early Jesus music artists, Keith might be considered to be part of that mountain. His life, albeit short, was lived to the full. By the time he was 11, he was already being groomed as the next big superstar, with his parents fully in support. He released a number of singles on Decca Records. But as hopes of being a star were dashed, he ran away at the age of 15 and was caught in the middle of the hippie movement, where a mixture of free love, drugs, and searching for spiritual truth were a part of the culture. In his search for truth, Keith was driven to Jesus, but still had uncertainties about accepting the Bible totally and completely. And he remained wary of what was going on in the church. It was at this time that he met 2 very important people in his life, his good friend Randy Stonehill and his wife Melody. After Keith and Melody were married, then still grappling with their commitment to Christ, Randy challenged them to attend a home group that he had been attending and for them to go while he was out on the road traveling and doing a tour. Well, Keith and Melody, they accepted the challenge, went to the home group Bible study, and were radically saved. That was in 1975. Failing to land a mainstream record deal, Keith turned to the Christian music industry and was initially signed to Sparrow Records. After 2 albums, Keith negotiated a release from Sparrow to start Pretty Good Records, where Keith was allowed to refuse to charge for albums and allow people to obtain his music by paying whatever they were able to afford. It was just unheard of. Imagine that happening today. It's amazing that in 7 years of knowing the Lord, from 1975 to 1982, Keith and Melody provided shelter for many in California that developed into Last Days Ministries. This grew as they developed newsletters and magazines, and then because they were busting at the seams, they moved to Texas, where they purchased 140 acres of land. Keith and Melody also had a passion for missions and spent much time advocating for believers to go. And it's hard to believe that he released 5 albums from 1977 through 1982 and was gone July 28th of that year. There would be 3 albums released after Keith's death of previously recorded unreleased songs. After that, many compilation albums. Keith was with us for such a short time, but his impact on the church is undeniable. I didn't become a believer until 1984, almost 2 years after Keith's passing. And of course, at that time, I was into rockier, heavier music. But a couple years later, our church hired an assistant pastor Pastor Bob. And we would have conversations and we became friends. And I was still pretty young in the Lord and just exuberant about things. And I would talk about how some of these artists that I was listening to were just such passionate people. And Pastor Bob, who always kind of got that glint in his eye, you knew something was coming, would say to me, "Well, have you ever listened to Keith Green's music?" Now, I had probably heard a couple of his worship songs, There Is a Redeemer and Created Me a Clean Heart, but I never really dug into his music. But on Pastor Bob's recommendation, I decided to go get a couple of his albums. And I was immediately impacted, both spiritually, but also just so impressed with how amazing Keith was musically, with melody, with his piano playing. It was all so great. I bought 3 albums. One of them was the Keith Green Collection, which was the 4th album that was released while he was still alive. The first one was For Him Who Has Ears to Hear, which I later obtained by cassette. And then after that was No Compromise and You Want to Go Back to Egypt. This album was kind of a greatest hits. It had songs from all 3 of those albums, plus a couple of previously unreleased songs, including the live version of Rushing Wind, which was one of my favorite Keith Green songs. So I had that one. I also purchased Songs for the Shepherd, which was his last album before he passed away. It was a worship album that he decided to do when he was thinking of going in a totally other direction. And little did he know at the time that this would be the last album he'd do before he got taken from this earth. And then the other album I got was one of the albums that came out of previously unreleased material after he passed away, Jesus Commands Us to Go. All have just some great things on it. Been ministered to so much. So many great songs that he put out over the years. You Put This Love in My Heart. Your Love Broke Through, which I think I talked about before in an earlier episode. He'll Take Care of the Rest. He really did have a balance of the more serious, more deep stuff and some lighter stuff. If you want something really light, listen to a song like So You Want to Go Back to Egypt. It's pretty fun, a lot of fun. So anyways, those were the albums, and then later on, like I said, I obtained the cassette of his first album, For Him Who Has Ears to Hear. And then after that, I purchased the book that came out about his life, No Compromise, which I read 3 or 4 times, including one time my wife and I read it out loud to our kids when they were younger. Just some great stuff, just more in-depth about his life and his legacy. No Compromise, Keith Green. So if you're new to Keith and his music and his ministry, you might be asking where to start. Well, my recommendation would be first to go on YouTube and look up the 2002 documentary that was done on his life, The Keith Green Story, Your Love Broke Through. It's posted on YouTube, and it's about an hour in length, and it'll give you a real good overview of his life with interviews from his wife and Randy Stonehill and others. It's really good. From there, I would go and start listening to his music. Where to start? Well, you can't go wrong with the Collection album, which, as I mentioned earlier, has got songs from his first 3 albums. You could also listen to his first album, For Him Who Has Ears to Hear, which again is probably one of the greatest debut albums from a Christian artist. And if you're into something or would like to hear something more worshipful, Songs for the Shepherd would be a great place to start. But really, you could start with any of his albums. And then from there, if you're able, I don't know if you can still get a copy somehow, get a copy of the book, No Compromise, and just read more detail about his life and his legacy. And that's what I would do if in my opinion. But what I want to know is if you're watching this and you've been someone who's followed Keith Green and his life and have been around for a long time, I want to hear your stories. How has Keith Green's music and his ministry impacted your life? If you were one of the ones that was a believer in following the Lord and knew about Keith's music when he was still alive, what was that like? How did you feel when you first heard his music? Were you ever in the position that you actually saw him perform live? And what was that like? I'd love to hear from you. And again, if you're new to Keith Green and you check out his music, don't hesitate to drop me a line as well and let me know what you think of the music by this legendary Christian artist who left quite a legacy, and it still lives on today. Thank you very much for watching. Come join me again next week when we have another episode of Andrew's Journey in Christian Contemporary Music. God bless, and bye for now.